There is a moment where everything inside you tells you to stop. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. It appears as a thought, a suggestion, a simple sentence. This is enough. And most people accept it immediately. They don't question it. They don't examine it. They don't resist it. Because it feels true. It feels accurate. It feels like the body has reached its limit. But in most cases, that moment is not the limit. It is the first test. The first point where the mind begins to protect itself, to conserve energy, to avoid discomfort. That protection is automatic. It is built into you. It is part of how the mind operates. But it is not always correct. Because the mind does not measure your true capacity. It estimates. It predicts. It assumes. And it assumes too early. This is why people stop while they still have more to give. More energy. More focus. More endurance. The signal feels final. But it is only the beginning of resistance. That resistance is uncomfortable. It creates tension. It creates pressure. It creates doubt. And that discomfort convinces you that stopping is correct. But discomfort is not a limit. It is a signal that effort has begun. The moment things feel difficult, the moment the mind starts negotiating, the moment the urge to stop appears, that is where the real process starts. Most people never stay long enough to experience that. They step back too early. They disengage too quickly. They trust the first signal. And because they trust it, they never discover what exists beyond it. Beyond that first signal, there is more capacity, more endurance, more control. But it is only accessible if you continue, if you stay, if you do not obey immediately. This is where separation begins. Not between strong and weak, but between those who obey the mind and those who question it. One group stops, the other continues. At first, the difference is almost invisible. A few extra seconds, a few extra steps, a small extension of effort. But that small extension changes everything, because it breaks the pattern, the automatic response, the habit of stopping. And once that pattern is broken, control begins to shift. From the mind to you. The mind may speak first, but it does not have to decide. And the moment you see that, you stop treating discomfort as the end.
The second signal is stronger than the first.
The first one is a suggestion. The second feels like a command. If you continue past the initial urge to stop, the mind does not go silent. It escalates. The discomfort sharpens. The resistance intensifies. The thoughts become more convincing. This is too much. You've gone far enough. You're pushing too hard. At this point, the mind is no longer suggesting. It is attempting to regain control. And most people give in here, because the intensity feels real. It feels like the body is reaching failure, but again, it is still early. The mind is reacting to unfamiliar strain, to effort it is not used to sustaining, to discomfort it has not been trained to tolerate. This reaction is predictable, because the mind prefers known patterns, predictable effort, controlled environments. When you move beyond those patterns, it interprets it as risk, and it responds by trying to stop you. Not because you are incapable, but because it is unfamiliar. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They assume the intensity means they have reached their limit. They assume the signal is accurate. But the signal is not measuring capacity. It is reacting to discomfort, and discomfort can be extended, adapted to, controlled. If you stay just a little longer, if you continue just a little further, the intensity begins to change. The chaos settles. The breathing stabilizes. The mind stops escalating. Because you did not obey. You stayed. That moment teaches the mind something new, that the signal was not final, that the discomfort was not dangerous, that effort can continue. This is how control is built, not by eliminating resistance, but by outlasting it. The first time is difficult. The second time is still uncomfortable. But each repetition reduces the power of the signal, because the mind begins to adapt. It recalibrates. It adjusts its expectations. What once felt extreme begins to feel manageable. What once felt like a limit becomes part of the process. This is where endurance begins to form, not through one moment of effort, but through repeated exposure to resistance. Each time you continue, you weaken the mind's authority. You extend your capacity. You stabilize your discipline. And slowly, the signal loses its control. It still appears, but it no longer decides, because you've already gone beyond it. And once you do that, you realize the mind was never the limit. If this message resonates with you, like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who are done waiting. After enough repetition, the signal begins to change. It still appears, the same voice, the same suggestion, the same urge to stop. But it feels different, less urgent, less convincing, less dominant, because it has lost something, authority. The first time you obeyed it without question. The second time you hesitated. The third time you resisted. Now you recognize it. You expect it. You see it before it fully forms. And that awareness changes everything. Because once a pattern is recognized, it can no longer control you the same way. The signal becomes predictable, almost mechanical, a routine response from the mind. You feel the resistance, but you are no longer surprised by it. You are no longer overwhelmed by it. It becomes part of the process, not the end of it. This is where discipline stabilizes, not because effort disappears, but because your response becomes consistent. You act regardless of the signal. You continue regardless of the discomfort. You move regardless of how it feels. At this stage, the mind is no longer leading. It is following. It adjusts to your behavior, not the other way around. That shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it removes hesitation. It removes negotiation. You no longer ask if you should continue. You continue. That consistency creates momentum. Momentum reduces friction. Friction no longer disrupts the process, and the mind adapts again. But this time, it adapts to discipline. The signals still exist, but they weaken. They shorten. They lose intensity because they are no longer reinforced. They are no longer obeyed. And anything that is not reinforced eventually fades. This is how control becomes stable, not through one moment of strength, but through repeated refusal to stop. Day after day, action after action, signal after signal ignored, until the mind no longer interrupts the process. It becomes background, noise without influence. And you continue. Not because it became easy, but because you became consistent. And once consistency takes over, the mind is no longer the limit. At a certain point, the struggle becomes quieter. Not because it disappears, but because it changes form. The resistance is still there. The signal still appears. The discomfort still exists. But it no longer disrupts you. It becomes background, something you notice, but do not react to. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline removes resistance. They think it eliminates effort. It does not. It changes your relationship to it. The discomfort feels the same. The effort feels the same. The signal feels familiar. But your response is different. You no longer hesitate. You no longer pause to consider stopping. You no longer negotiate. You act immediately, consistently. That consistency removes friction, because friction comes from hesitation, from delay, from internal debate. Once the debate is gone, the action becomes clean. This is where performance stabilizes, not because you feel stronger, but because you stop interrupting yourself. Most people are not limited by their capacity. They are limited by how often they stop, how often they step back, how often they obey the signal, how often they disengage. Remove that interruption, and everything changes. Effort becomes continuous. Focus becomes stable. Progress becomes consistent. This is the real advantage. Not intensity, not motivation, not temporary bursts of effort, but uninterrupted action, moving through discomfort without stopping, without questioning, without breaking the pattern. That is what builds momentum, and momentum compounds, quietly, relentlessly, day after day, step after step, effort layered on effort, until the gap becomes obvious between those who stop and those who do not. One is controlled by resistance, the other moves through it, and that difference grows over time. Because once you stop interrupting yourself, your capacity is no longer limited by your mind. And what remains is how far you are willing to go. In the end, nothing about this is dramatic. There is no sudden transformation, no moment where everything becomes easy, no point where the mind goes silent. The signal remains, the discomfort remains, the resistance remains. What changes is you. You stop reacting to the signal. You stop interpreting discomfort as the end. You stop obeying the first thought. And that shift is enough, because it removes the only thing that was holding you back. Interruption, hesitation, internal negotiation. Without those, action becomes continuous. Effort becomes stable. Progress becomes inevitable. Not fast, not explosive, but consistent. And consistency compounds, quietly, without attention, without recognition. Day after day, you continue, even when it feels unnecessary, even when it feels uncomfortable. And over time, the results begin to appear. Not suddenly, but gradually. A wider capacity, a stronger baseline, a more stable discipline. At that point, the difference becomes clear between those who follow the signal and those who move past it. One remains where they started. The other continues to expand, not because they are different, but because they responded differently to the same discomfort, to the same resistance, to the same signal. One stopped, the other stayed. That is the entire difference. The mind may quit first, but it only becomes a limit if you follow it. If this made you see it clearly, like the video and subscribe. The next signal will come. Decide what you do with it.